All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Buonasera to our colleagues in Italy. It is great to be here. My name is Anthony Weiss. I'll be the moderator for this session on neuroethical impacts of digital psychiatry, digital monitoring, remote mental health. And I'm thrilled to have three great colleagues here to help us think through some of the ethical pros and cons of a real shift in mental health care that we've seen over the past year. This is a session that's co-sponsored by the Italian Society for Neuroethics. I want to thank Sarah Sangorian, who's here with us, and she's going to help moderate the chat, as well as Andrea Lavazza. I don't know if Andrea is here. Yes, good to see you. This is also co-sponsored by the International Neuroethics Society, and I think we have Robert Beets here. I don't know if Karen Graham is here, and I also want to thank Nita Farahani for her support of this as well. So it's great to have this co-sponsored session on a topic that's really, really important and I think timely. And this conversation emerges out of what is our common shared experience across the globe, and that is from the COVID pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic and the crisis that was engendered by it led to so much devastation and challenge across the world. But interestingly, it's also led to a lot of innovation, a lot of new ways of doing things in society, as well as particularly within healthcare. And one of the ways in which healthcare has changed, at least here in Boston, where I'm located, is a greater use of remote mental health care, telehealth, telepsychiatry, remote monitoring, which had been starting pre-COVID, but really got a boost of energy from the pandemic as patients really weren't able to come into on-site care and needed ways to access care. And so like many things, this crisis has spawned some innovation in a pinch or out of necessity. And I think as hopefully here and elsewhere, we're starting to see the pandemic start to calm and wane. It's a good time for us to evaluate whether this is all good and what aspects of this remote telepsychiatry, remote mental health care is actually an ethical good, and what aspects of that may be ethically challenging, and what we should be looking out for over the next year or two or 10. And so to discuss that, I've got three great panelists here. Let me just briefly introduce them, and then we'll launch into a conversation and then take your questions at the end. So first, we've got Dr. Cindy Sieck. Cindy's an assistant professor of family medicine at the Ohio State University in Ohio, United States. And Cindy's work focuses on the interaction between health information technology, and patient engagement, and the ways in which patients can or cannot access and utilize that type of information. So Cindy, thank you. Welcome to our panel. Dr. John Torous is here. John is a colleague of mine here at Harvard Medical School. He's an assistant professor at the medical school and the director of the digital psychiatry division at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. John is one of the world's experts in the use of remote apps, and particularly in the mental health space. He's a psychiatrist and a clinical informaticist, and I think he has a background in electrical engineering and all sorts of other things as well. So John, thank you for being here. I appreciate your being on the call. And Dr. Nicole Martinez. Nicole is an assistant professor at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Stanford University in California, USA. And has a background, both has a law degree from Harvard Law School, as well as, I believe, a PhD in social science from the University of Chicago, and brings a really unique perspective from both the law and social anthropology to the work she does, which largely looks at a cross-cultural lens on some of the aspects of mental health care, mental health delivery. And thank you, Nicole, for being here today. So, and I'm Anthony Weiss. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm here in Boston at Harvard Medical School. And my work is largely in the Center for Biomedical Ethics here at Harvard, And I also lecture in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard, as well as at Beth Fitzgerald Deaconess Medical Center. So with that, why don't we start with some definitions? I've thrown around a bunch of terms here, digital this and that, and remote this and that. Maybe we could start with what are these things? How are they related? Is there an overarching kind of framework or term that we should be using? John, maybe I'll start with you and get your perspective on some of that.
No, first, thank you for inviting me. This is a wonderful forum for these issues, especially now. I think the nosology and terminology is a very central issue. It's also one that there's no international consensus, surprisingly. A very smart person from a different country actually emailed me and said, my country, John, is beginning to look into kind of supporting, we'll say, more digital health services, but I'm having a very hard time understanding the literature and what to offer because all the same things are called different names in different places. And how do I actually figure out what is this digital health you're talking about and what is not this digital health that you're talking about? So I'm going to give you my shot at an overview, realizing again that there's no consensus, but let's start with digital health as this big encompassing term. And we're going to break it up into telehealth on one hand and kind of monitoring technologies on the other hand, right? So we have digital health as both telehealth and its monitoring. If we now look at the telehealth arm, there's two types of telehealth. There's synchronous, what we're doing now, right? I'm talking to each of you at the same time, and there's asynchronous, right? You write me an email and hopefully I get back to it in a reasonable time and we do it. So there's digital health, we have telehealth, we have synchronous and asynchronous. Then there's this whole monitoring arm, right? So imagine that I have a Fitbit on, I don't have any wearables, that's a different story for a different day, but there's monitoring technologies, right? Which may or may not be used as part of health. And when we think of monitoring technologies, there's two types of data I can monitor. There's active data where I have to actively take a survey and engage. If I don't take a survey how I'm feeling, you don't know what's happening. And there's passive, right? You could get GPS from my phone and thus kind of understand where I'm moving around. I didn't leave home today. I didn't go to work. So in kind of what sometimes get called, so on the digital health, then we have kind of the monitoring side and we have this kind of passive data. Sometimes that's called digital phenotyping. Sometimes it's called social sensing. Sometimes that whole cluster is called remote monitoring. But I think, again, if we think of digital health, monitoring can be active and passive data. And then again, we have telehealth, which can be synchronous and asynchronous. That may at least give us some guidance on where these things live. And of course, there's many reasons why digital phenotyping could be used as part of telecare. But that's my best attempt to keep it relatively simple.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a great framework. And as you think about those different groupings, the telehealth side, the monitoring side, and then the breakdown of each of those, I'm curious about what each of you has seen in terms of the last year of the pandemic. And are we seeing growth in all of these areas, in just some of these areas? I'm curious what you're seeing as a clinician, John, and then see if others have other comments.
So I think we're seeing tremendous growth in all of them. Again, in asynchronous, one example being there's a lot of startups. I don't endorse or not endorse any, we're not here, but look at the funding for something like something called Talkspace. There's an article, if you type in Talkspace Reno for the city, asynchronous telehealth, that company got a contract to provide a city in Nevada, US state, with telehealth service. So asynchronous is definitely growing. I think synchronous, what mental health clinician has not done a synchronous video visit in the last year. If we think again, the monitoring technologies, just look at what all these wearables are out there and all these sensors are out there. So I think they're all growing tremendously. Clearly, telehealth has probably grown, asynchronous telehealth has grown the most because there's an established practice and business model and regulation for it, right? It's an extension of traditionally in-person care. So it has less hurdles around implementing it. Again, the asynchronous, is it clinical care? Where is it not clinical care? If you get a text message, who can deliver asynchronous therapy? It's growing, but again, there's a lot more uncertainty around it. And the monitoring sensors, I think, on a research side, right, if we had better information on how people were doing, if you said, hey, John's sleep pattern is getting worse and his mood is getting worse, that's very important information that can drive into the telehealth and make those telehealth visits more personal. So I think we've seen a lot of growth in that, and especially in the research field. I think, of course, there's always going to be a company that says they can do it, right? That's their job in the commercial landscape, is to sell stuff, right? And they're going to sell stuff by pushing the boundaries or pushing a little bit farther. That's what marketing is defined to do, right? To influence how we make decisions. So I haven't seen as many kind of commercial advances in the sensor space per se, at least around delivering care, but I think it's rapidly progressing. One example is Google bought Fitbit. And again, it's in the future, all Fitbits, it was announced yesterday, going to soon come under the Google Health brand. And they're going to kind of have to go through a Google device for your Fitbit to work. So these aren't small time issues when Google is getting involved.
Yeah, so thank you. And Cindy or Nicole, in the literature, in the work that you're seeing growth in these areas. I assume anything else that you want to call out or particularly comment on?
I think certainly, we've seen growth in the use of telehealth, the comfort with telehealth on the part of both patients and providers, greater familiarity and kind of, when COVID hit and we all went into lockdown, I know at our institution, the clinicians just had to jump in and figure it out. And that's been, a tremendous amount of learning and getting more comfortable. I think in the funding world too, there are, all of these different sensors and all of these other remote monitoring technologies that, maybe we were less comfortable with before. And now we have a little better understanding of why this might be better, why, if you can monitor an elderly person's blood pressure remotely, then you can keep tabs on their health and keep them, out of a doctor's office or someplace that might put them at risk, certainly during COVID, but also, maybe during cold and flu season moving forward. And so there's kind of a more shift, I think, of both patients and providers getting more understanding of, what this technology can do. Of course, then that raises concerns about what the technology can do, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
And what I would add is, for example, John just brought up the deal with Google. And so, a lot of the framing of this right now is within digital psychiatry in terms of, under the auspices of healthcare or medical care. But there's also, of course, the way that, this is seen out in the consumer space and how, that is filling a need. And there's certainly a lot more demand in that area. And I think, that ties into a number of ethical issues in terms of sort of how to properly approach, regulate, think about how these different sort of models of care work together. But, I would also note in the consumer space, you have some apps like Headspace, which is a mindfulness or meditation app that, in talking to, a number of clinicians out there, it tends to be recommended a fair amount, as, something to sort of assist people on the side. But right now, in response to the pandemic, they had offered, free services. And that's sort of also another angle of a number of consumer companies sort of seeing that opening to give people, in need a taste of their services. But that will come to an end at a certain point. And, also, just to note that this isn't quite under that digital health, but just in terms of the great need there is and the way that people go and find the different services, what I've also been finding out is sort of a fairly sort of sizable number of people telling me about, for example, going to YouTube. And, and so, this is the sort of spillover of all that need, are these sort of different areas where if people aren't able to, have the insurance or have the access, these are the sort of different layers of kind of digital or electronic means that people may try and find that additional assistance.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it reminds me of maybe the self-help aisle of bookstores being an extension of the psychiatric or mental health clinic. And now you're seeing kind of an expansion of the self-help aisle of the digital bookstore, so to speak, and people are starting to seek out and look for solutions where they might find them, whether that's YouTube or in other locations. Why don't I start with some of the upsides of this? So let's start on the positive. What are you all seeing in terms of upsides of some of the developments, growth of these technologies, whether we're talking about telehealth or we're talking about the monitoring aspect of that? Cindy, maybe we can start with you. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that, certainly in some ways it improves access for people who can access it. You have, it's easier to get an appointment. It's easier to take time out of your schedule to do an appointment. And even, if we figure out, I guess during COVID, there was a lot of relaxing of rules in the US about, working across state lines. And so, that can help us in areas where they don't have a lot of providers. These services can really, help to fix that. Here where I live in Ohio, we're near an Air Force base. That kind of telehealth or telepsychiatry can help, consistency can help a person stay with the same provider if they have to move around. And the younger population seems to be, much more into that. So I think that kind of access has been great. And I think also just the innovation that has come from, thinking about how can we use this technology. I mean, that was always there, but sort of more, I think, limited to, computer science folks and folks who were developing these tools. And I think that now we are more open to accepting these kinds of technologies and the innovation that can come along with it. And I think that if you get, more multidisciplinary folks thinking about it, it's going to bring even more innovation.
I was on mute. So access and public acceptance of technology in healthcare, good points. Nicole, what would you add to that?
I think those are really big areas. And so, with talking to, a number of clinicians in terms of, having some initial, skepticism or concerns about moving to telehealth and then just being pushed into it, over the last year. I think it's really sort of remarkable, a number of them really seeing those upsides. And I do think that connection and access, really is a big part that really is important. And, in terms of, sort of moving quickly, but looking at some of the areas that help open that up better in the US, there's been changes that allow more reimbursement of telehealth services that have, certainly been welcome. I think a sort of look more at the practical side of things about what types of regulation, what types of models may work best. And again, it's access, but it's also really being able to reach people where they are, which I've heard over and over again as something that is very helpful and certainly seen as a move forward in terms of mental health, being able to provide that mental health resources and care.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So it's not just you have access, meaning that you're allowed to come in or that you're welcomed in, but that access may be meaningless if you really can't leave your home because of childcare or because of transportation issues. And so it's actually access plus, or I don't know, we'll think of a fancier word for that, but something along those lines. John, what are your thoughts? What are the upsides of all of this? What are you seeing from where you sit?
Yeah. If we go back to this nosology of kind of the monitoring technologies, I think what's on that front really exciting is we can begin to better understand someone's lived experience of mental illness. As a field, we don't have any validated biomarkers, right? I mean, we have a lot of experimental things. We've done lots of brain research, lots of genetic research, but there's no biomarker that's used in routine clinical care around the world where we go, you know, this is where your depression is, this is your progression. So there's certainly interest in increasing research on, again, what will there be digital biomarkers that could help us understand, monitor, even look at to try to prevent these illnesses, right? And again, that's still in a research phase, but I think that research is certainly has some pluses, some minuses. We'll talk about the ethical parts soon. It's certainly not to be missed. But I think on the plus side, right, whenever has the field of psychiatry got a whole new chance to kind of understand people's functional outcomes of mental illness, the relationships around it, right, the real world ability. It's not, we won't ignore what people experience. That's still the central part of it, right? We've never moved to what people care about, right? Again, they're just daily functioning. That's what people want. And it's been so hard to characterize that, and clearly building a new functional nosology of real-time information from consumer devices is going to be hard. It's not going to happen this year, probably not going to happen next year. It's going to take a lot of work to get there, but that's very exciting because that's the foundation, right? To really rethink about what is a mental illness, what does prevention mean like, how do we allocate funding and resources? So I think there's a lot of potential on that monitoring side, even if, again, it's not under this telehealth umbrella of synchronous or asynchronous. We may not be always using it today. And I think, but going back to the telehealth side, we flipped and say, well, again, clearly the access really has been improved. And I think, as someone said, sometimes the practical things, right? I kind of asked some of the folks I were, I said, you know, what is it that's making you want to kind of continue to do telehealth visits, or do you want to come in and see me in person at Beth Israel now? And perhaps I overthink things. I kept going like, let's talk about like the relationship, what it means to talk through a screen. The person's like, parking fees, John, parking. That's what I was like, oh. So sometimes it's just, again, very, very practical things of parking fees is like outweighing all these like meta things. I think I was a psychiatrist, like boundaries and what it means to be with me and presence of the room and my college parking. So
yes, yeah, great comments. So and let me just unpack a little bit of what you said about the nosology and maybe a shift in a framework. What I'm seeing is potential for greater objectivity. So rather than how's your sleep? I'm sleeping okay. It's over the last 7 days, it looks like you've actually slept an average of 6.3 hours, right? So greater objectivity about symptoms that we believe are part and parcel of the syndromes of mental illness that we're concerned about. But it sounded like you were moving maybe even beyond that, John. Do you have kind of an explanation or a thought about what did you mean by kind of a shifting toward a more functional assessment of mental health?
And if you think how we even say define depression, right, by the presence of certain symptoms present for a certain amount of time that interfere with someone's life. And those are practical definitions. It works, right? We've used it for a long time. It's not bad per se, but sometimes, right, it's not really covering aspects that we also know matter. Like, again, how are someone's relationships going? How is their cognition going, right? What is their quality of life? Again, I think all of us working with patients ask these questions, right? We don't just check off boxes and go, here's your diagnosis. But again, sometimes these are really tricky things to quantify, and they change, right? They're dynamic. These things change with time. And really thinking of mental illnesses, again, as dynamic processes that change with environment and across time, right? Across these two dimensions. We're going from a single dot of here you are to here you are across time and across different environments. I think it's hard to almost conceptualize what health looks like across time and environment, because at least I was trained in a system that we said kind of, here's what it is, it roughly stays the same. Yeah, maybe it may change in 6 months, check up on someone and take a look then. But I think, again, we can certainly capture, for better or worse, we can capture a lot of data across environment and time. There's a lot of tech companies that have this data, and we'll get later, using it for marketing. We get pushed marketing based on it, but we haven't yet kind of been pushed mental health across time and space. And I think all of us intuitively know, a lot of my patients with depression, they have anxiety. It's very rare to find like pure depression or to find pure anxiety. So, you only have anxiety, my gosh, there's nothing else. Or I think also clinically seen, there's a lot of overlap, right? And there's also overlap in treatments. You go, well, we probably haven't categorized these things perfectly, right? If we kind of have similar symptoms, similar treatments. So there probably is better ways to dive in and say, this is a cluster, John, of your symptoms, and it's most likely to respond to who knows what, right, in the future. But it's an exciting potential for a field, right, that hasn't always been on the forefront of innovation, to somehow have been thrust front and center, right? In some ways, we can go farther than cardiology with this. Like, we can go farther than diabetes. It's just we've been given a very rare opportunity.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so it is really interesting to think about it in that perspective. I don't know, Cindy or Nicole, if you have anything to add, maybe from a sociologic standpoint, the shifting viewpoints of mental health. The other aspect of this is, I guess, we're not used to being kind of on the front page of major interests in innovation, and so at some level, it's great to see that companies and governments and people are interested in mental health. I don't know, anything else to add to what John was talking about?
I agree. It's a hugely exciting opportunity, and what I would add to that in terms of having spoken to a number of developers of these types of technologies, where this issue of nosology and categories is something both exciting, but definitely something they're wrestling with. In terms of, for example, validating the instruments where you're validating against, a DSM or existing categories, but sort of knowing that what you're trying to reach is probably something a little bit different. And it's both exciting, but it's definitely a sort of challenge in the area. There's also, in terms of, a number of apps, for example, this question also of, not just sort of categories, but what it means to have, to be effective, and to have, made a difference in as John was just saying, in the functioning, positive difference, and that maybe some of those measures also, that they're thinking about, once you are able to assess, more and more as people go about their daily lives, what it means also to, assess positive change that might be a little different than the way it had been thought about before. The ethics side, I'll keep this short because I agree overall it's very exciting, but in terms of applications in other areas, I think there's always also an area to be both, wary and hopeful, that also in breaking down different categories that might be of interest, whether if you're thinking of what might be of interest in the legal field, for example, or education, where they also may be looking for different types of risk factors to identify people. I think there's identify people who are behaviorally at risk. I think that there's always reason to also have caution about how that may affect different groups differently according to sort of race, culture, socioeconomic status, in terms of what it means to meaningfully address these categories in ways that is beneficial across different groups.
I would just add, this does represent kind of an explosion of data that is available for analysis in so many ways, and it can be used positively to help us identify, define what benefit is, more fully understand what benefit is, also to understand kind of who benefits from what. But like Nicole was saying, there can also be challenges with what do we do with all of that information?
Awesome. So that's a nice transition to, so what are the downsides of this? I'm curious about, maybe you could identify what is your biggest concern? What do you see as the biggest risk of this shift into more use of monitoring, digital monitoring, mental health? If you had to say, what's your biggest concern? Nicole, maybe we'll start with you on this one. What would you say? What's the biggest risk here?
If we're talking about the monitoring side, I think we don't have yet a system of appropriate system of privacy and data governance that really provides a sort of strong foundation of both balancing the scientific and social benefit from all potential social benefit from all of this information against the ways that it may be used that present risks for people, I think even though there's been a lot of movement, for example, the GDPR in Europe, you have, in California, here in the States, you have, different movements towards, better informing, consumers or the public of, how their data may be used. You have, those type of attention to it. It's still not necessarily protecting people from the inferences sometimes that may be drawn from their data, both in the consumer space, but also sometimes in terms of potential, government monitoring or otherwise. I think to more fully realize these benefits from the data, that's one big area. And again, I'll note that, these types of monitoring or surveillance concerns can also, again, affect, different communities, different populations differently in terms of the risks for marginalized groups of what might be done with their data. In the US, our privacy regulations are very much centered around de-identifying data in terms of medical or health data, but more and more that can be re-identified. And that's where, even though we have approaches towards it, for healthcare or for medical, that's not always as as protective as we would like in terms of seeing these downstream risks to people. And that's part of where having a sort of fuller, more robust governance structure, but that also balances the need, for scientific use of the data, I think is an important concern.
That's great. Yeah. So focus on privacy, but beyond that, and maybe disparate aspects of that in different populations. Cindy, you've written on this digital divide concept. I'm wondering, what are you seeing as some of the downsides? Is it potentially related to that?
Oh yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see, in that it's really not one digital divide, but really multiple divides. I think often it gets segmented into urban versus rural, younger versus older, and kind of that's it. But we forget that, or we don't take note that there are across the country pockets of people in urban areas who don't have access, and access is really beyond just having a device and being able to use the internet, having internet in your home or somewhere else accessible to you. But it also looks at things like, how do you have to have the most up-to-date device to be able to use these systems, whether it's for telehealth or telemonitoring. Do you have to have the skills to download the latest software? We relaxed some of those rules during COVID to make it so that to do a telehealth visit, you basically click on a link. Some of that is going to go away as we move back into whatever this next normal is. And I think also, as Nicole was saying, the protections that are there, you have to be able to understand a lot about what these privacy rules are and how each of these apps is going to use your data. And I think that that's hard for everybody. It's harder for some groups than for others. And so, I would hope that there is also a focus on making sure that that part is understandable as well for everyone.
Yeah, and some of the work involved in making sure that there is digital literacy, that's not really compensated, I guess. And certainly as a physician, I have to say, I was never really trained in how to do that or how to make sure that someone is able to kind of access that. John, I think you've done some work in that in the digital clinic you have, but there may be other issues that you're concerned about. What are your thoughts?
I think the potential, I think we've covered it well, and I think everyone in the audience probably has their own favorite use case or where it's going. But we're probably at a point where sometimes it's easy to ignore these downsides, especially the security part that Nicole is talking about. There was actually an article that came out, the story happened a while, but in Wired magazine just a couple of weeks ago in Finland, there was a company that was offering telehealth and the medical records got hacked, which happens for mental health. What was unique about this is the hackers then took the mental health notes and emailed each patient one by one, said, I am going to blackmail you and release your individual note, right? Usually we see healthcare systems get hacked, but when do we see again a person, again, and that just shows you how valuable and personal mental health data is, right? This is different. It doesn't say, John, you have diabetes and here's your A1C, or John, you have high cholesterol, right? This is, again, I don't think I've ever seen hackers do that to an individual person. So I think it just says we really need to hold ourselves up to a higher standard because we have data that is really, again, more sensitive. And we have, sadly, a real example of this. I think if we think of in the digital health, telehealth, asynchronous, these kind of mindfulness meditation apps, the Achilles here that no one wants to talk about is engagement is not strong. People stop using these apps after just a couple tries and days. One example is the Veterans Administration in the US puts out actually a good app. I'm allowed to recommend apps from the VA because they're non-commercial. I can say that when I've cleared it with our hospital. So our Veterans Administration puts out good free apps. One is called COVID Coach. It helps you with stress around COVID. So broadly applicable whether you're in the armed service or not. They published a paper a couple months ago with, engagement with COVID Coach, 98.5% of people stopped using it after 2 weeks. It's just done. And you don't see a lot of commercial apps sharing that data because it doesn't look great. Again, there's an engagement trouble, and that's not surprising. Behavior change is hard, but handing people an asynchronous app and saying, use it, it's going to be great, is not always the easiest part. When we think now of synchronous telehealth, again, as Cynthia said, we do have to make sure everyone can connect and use it. Our team works with a lot of patients with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In the US, we call it serious mental illness. It's more a bureaucratic classification, but there's good data that people with kind of serious mental illness or some diseases have sometimes less access. It's less of an issue perhaps here in the US, but certainly less skills around using it. Our team has been trying to teach people to use smartphones for mental health. We have a website called skills.digitalpsych.org. And it's been interesting kind of doing this kind of teaching people to use their smartphones to download apps like Zoom, download self-help apps. People can learn and they're actually excited to learn no matter what their mental illness is. It's just no one's ever said, hey, let's do it. And we don't even have a good scale to kind of assess digital mental health literacy. So it's hard to even as a clinician think about it, let alone measure it. And if you measure it, there's really not that many things to refer people to today. So in some ways, it seems that the innovation we need isn't another AI algorithm. It's let's help John connect to the internet and kind of use what's there. And as Nicole pointed on the sensors, we're getting a lot of data, right? The sensors do know where you live, right? That they know, get your GPS, your phone knows where you live. Your phone probably knows if you went to see someone you shouldn't see because GPS probably went somewhere it shouldn't be. Your phone probably knows if you're having an affair, if you're calling someone, right? There's a lot of sensitive data in there. And I think I'm always surprised at the ways we can re-identify stuff in the future, stuff that we think is kind of completely de-identified today. Some very smart person comes up with an algorithm and says, hey, I can now make sense of this. So it is interesting to say, what is the risk benefit for people and kind of giving up all of this data? And one thing we've learned just is sometimes people don't understand what they're giving up in all of this data too. If I at least look at those terms and conditions and I'm like, that's a lot of words, and those are really confusing, and they forced me to go to school for many, many years. And I don't always know what I'm agreeing to, but especially what if I'm agreeing to kind of say, this is my mental health, these are my symptoms, my medication, this is where I sleep at night. That's really sensitive information that you, again, falls outside of, again, the US, our HIPAA context. So we do not have, again, is everyone said before, kind of a regulatory system or even any system to kind of harness this or keep the checks and balances.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on something you just said, and that is that, and then we'll get to maybe the final steps here and some next steps. But I'm curious about this concept of sustaining use of these tools, and it reminds me of distinctions between various psychotherapies, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic therapy, and some of the research that was done on these, the benefits of these therapies didn't really show that a nuanced ability to come up with inferences about someone's psychodynamic, well-being, whatever. That didn't matter. What mattered was rapport with the therapist, and therapist rapport ended up being kind of something that crossed across all of those different approaches in terms of predictive of ultimate functional success for the patient. And I'm interested, as you're talking about fancy technologies, and that the value is not necessarily the newest AI algorithm, it's just getting someone to stay with something that's helping their behavior change. I'm curious, Cindy, or or others, if you've had, is there a kind of a rapport equivalent for this mental health technology? Are you aware of anything along those lines? And maybe not. Maybe it is just, as John was saying, maybe it's just the fact that you like the app and you find it easy to use, and you've kind of built it into your routine.
Or on the research side, if you think of there's a scale called the Working Alliance Inventory for like how you and your therapist get along. Mm-hmm. And as you guys can tell, I need analogies to think of things, but the Working Alliance Inventory has three kind of factors. One is like, is the goal that you and your therapist are working towards, is it the same? The other part are the steps towards that goal. Do they make sense, right? Is your therapist saying, go run a marathon tomorrow? And you're like, I just can't do that. The third factor is kind of like a handrail on those steps. Do you have the support to go towards the goal? And do you have the support to stop from falling backwards? So you kind of think like, is the technology have the right goal? Does it have the right steps to get you to the goal? Is there enough support to keep you going forward and stop you from falling backwards? We made up a scale where we just took the Working Alliance Inventory and put a D in front of it because we said digital. So we said this is a digital Working Alliance Inventory. To be really exciting, we said, let's take off, I think the therapist helps me towards the goal. I think the app helps me towards the goal. Right. So we basically we switched the words. But it's interesting, a team from Wisconsin that we don't work with read the paper and picked it up and said, we're actually going to assess can we assess each week of people using a self-help app, how does a digital Working Alliance Inventory, what does it measure? And they actually did some interesting psychometrics, and it said, it seems to be the same as the Working Alliance Inventory that these people copied off. And that's a good thing because it's agnostic to people's background, their kind of level of distress they're starting out with. And they actually showed, so people that form a higher Working Alliance Inventory seem to have better engagement with the app and have better outcomes. So at least it's a way we can measure where someone is with the app. It doesn't tell us, why do I find this app engaging, and why does Nicole say, oh my gosh, this app is horrible, and why does Cynthia say this one is the best, right? We don't know why, but I think it's at least a tool to say, where are we on the journey, which is a start.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, kind of the promise of this is that it is a start. And so it lets us get at some of that stuff. We need to do more work to understand the context and kind of, who does an app work for and in what situations. And we're still probably a long ways away from that. But I like that it's a start.
No, I think this goes again to sort of where there's a flip of the promise of this is also in being able to have features that may be able to be adapted and appealing to different people, different types of groups. And that's definitely part of the appeal of it. And right now, though, there still are some concerns, though, about, the path towards doing that, what are inclusive and equitable ways of doing that, I was thinking, as sort of while you're talking also just about, again, in the consumer realm, but that sort of idea of usability and user experience, where I've heard some developers talk about that as a plus on the consumer side of, that they care about that, of having, the devices be of interest to, really be sort of usable. The downside is sometimes if they may use some of those attention tricks, that can be somewhat, like infinite scroll or things that are a little bit addictive, give that dopamine surge, but aren't necessarily what we're thinking of therapeutically. But also on the usability side, I think, there's a number of different areas also. I've heard, some people with, lived experience talk about how some apps created by, that were created by people who were, psychologists or doctors, with kind of unconsciously repeated a kind of language of therapeutic interaction, which the people actually, that was why they didn't like going to a therapist. And so they wanted something different. And again, this offers a chance to do something different. So that makes a sort of interesting side of it. But, certainly also thinking through what types of groups may need to be, reached more. I've certainly heard a number of people talk about, men in their 40s and 50s and above, really just sort of turning off and not being interested in digital health, having more problems to reach them in the past year, for certain things with telehealth. While, women 30s and 40s, it was more appealing, and sort of just thinking through of sort of how we're adapting the tools to reach these different groups.
And I would say, along with that, making sure that we have an equitable way of doing that, and not, this app is inexpensive, so you don't have a lot of resources, that's what you have to use.
Yeah, that's key. And I think there's a concern, mental health care, at least in the United States, has had this kind of two-pronged approach, with one prong being the ability to access kind of more elite mental health care, and the other prong, mental health care maybe that's offered through government or through other ways. And that's been a long-standing kind of historical blemish on mental health care in the United States. And I think you're mentioning trying to figure out, is this just going to perpetuate that, or is this going to actually make that better? Now we're running out of time, and we do want to take a few questions, but before we do that, let me just ask each of you, I'll give you 45 seconds to say, let's think about the future. So what should we do in the future? What could we do to make things even better? What could we do to mitigate some of the risks you've mentioned? This is your chance to say, if we could do one thing, what do you think is most important for us to be focusing on? Cindy, we're going to start with you. So what do you think about the future?
So if I have just one thing I would want a systematic assessment of people's, digital skills, literacy, and access that helps us understand more clearly where we are with that, and then helps us develop what we need to meet those needs.
So make that almost part of the initial intake into a healthcare system, or as part of everyone's assessment of where they are in terms of their well-being, to assess their digital capabilities in that realm. Great thought. John, what are your thoughts?
I think there's an assumption implicitly that only industry knows how to do this or build this. And I think in part we've been very reactive in kind of catching up to industry. And I think that's something we should probably flip, or just again question, just because someone says they can do it, we have to have those same standards. I'll also put in the chat, just one of the things, again, with patients I work with has always been like, what are these free apps? And truly free, not I use it. So in part of just like recommending the apps, we've built this neutral database. We don't endorse or not anything, but I think it's a useful resource of kind of, there's filters. And the idea is you have to kind of figure out what filters work for you. But we have a lot of filters towards price because that's the most important thing to people that I work with, at least. Like totally free is the filter that gets the most attention. So yeah.
Great. And Nicole, what are your thoughts? One thing about the future, what would you recommend?
I would actually go back to what Cynthia was saying about sort of equity and equitable access and equitable design. That right now we're developing these brilliant tools, but they're being put to use in the system in a way that is unfortunately going to end up repeating a number of those same divides and maybe accentuate some of those divides that we're concerned about. And so, finding those models, finding those frameworks for going forward to really being able to use those tools to make a more equitable mental health care system would be amazing.
Awesome. Well, we do have just a few minutes left to take some questions. Sarah, I don't know if there were questions in the chat or if any of you on the call today are interested in asking your question live. We're open for just a few minutes here.
So Tony, we do have a question from Robert, and Robert writes, what competencies of psychiatrists you think need to be bolstered the most through continuing education to best administer care through and with digital tools?
Yeah, good question. John, maybe you're in the best place to help with that one.
A lot.
What do you,
but
yeah.
To give a more practical answer, I'll put a paper in the chat, Robert. We almost thought of a new healthcare role called a digital navigator. It doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. Again, radiology as a radiology tech, pathology as a pathology tech. Maybe we need someone on the team who kind of can help be that bridge, help technology troubleshoot, help select apps, help preview data, right? Maybe again, we can't just keep asking poor clinicians, use this one and use this one. Like there's also room for like a human support. So this paper has like 100-page appendix, if you can find it, where we got really nerdy and wrote down learning objectives and like blah, blah, blah. So it's longer than it looks, but I think it has, the core principles are probably broadly applicable internationally.
That's
I know
great.
in the physical health world, there are organizations that are using community health workers to do exactly that, to help, to give community health workers a little more training in how you help people address digital access and literacy and skills. And so they can work to address those issues alongside other issues that they're working to address.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's practice management questions as well, or kind of the education around that, so that you move away from, I'm going to see you and in this 15-minute block and this 20-minute block, and that's just the way I operate, versus being more flexible about taking data in at different times of the day, and having the ability to respond in an asynchronous manner, again, in a manner that is potentially better for patients and can be worked into the day-to-day schedule for the clinician. Other questions?
So we have another question from Louisa. Do you think that the uptake and growth of telepsychiatry is greater in the US compared to other countries? And if so, what do you think are the regulatory, structural, and cultural reasons for this?
Yeah, I've not seen any data on that, so I don't know the international comparison and uptake of telepsychiatry. I can just speak to the United States experience here, which is that telepsychiatry was a nice to think about concept until the pandemic, when it was actually not only essential to reach out to patients, but also supported in terms of funding. And so for the first time, from the provider standpoint, it made financial sense to actually provide the psychiatric care, or actually any medical care through telehealth. And so a lot of the United States and the healthcare system is waiting to see what's going to happen to some of those financial supports from both payers as well as the government. I don't know, John or Cindy or Nicole, do you have any insights on what's happening internationally? Yeah, so I imagine it's the technology is obviously available worldwide, and much of this is feasible to do internationally. It may relate to the structures of healthcare and some of the payment for healthcare that's set up in those other countries.
I just would add, I know that, for example, Australia, definitely has it's, I think, usually called more e-mental health, but they have a fairly, strong e-mental health movement. I've also, just seen efforts to start building capacity in that way in some low to middle income countries like African countries or some Latin American countries. And it speaks to, what Tony was just saying, in that, there's definitely structural aspects involved of what kind of system there is, already in place, and how that may fit into that. Those are some areas where there's certainly been, sort of growth or movement towards that.
Yeah, and I would just add that there may be, obviously, the ethical issues that we've talked about would hold across the globe. Certainly, some of the concerns around privacy would be potentially even more concerning in countries where the relationship between government and the people of the country may not be a positive one in all aspects, and/or the issues around disparities in care maybe even felt more acutely in some countries where there's other cultural divides within the country. And so some of the concepts we've talked about are absolutely applicable outside of the United States.
What's exciting is, right, those countries could use these technologies to leapfrog their mental health systems, right, potentially, right? They could actually catch up if these did work, how in the promise section we talked about, if it really did those, it would be tremendous.
Absolutely, and the possibility even there of obviously licensing and payment have precluded international healthcare, but there wouldn't be much to preclude that, so that I could potentially help someone in another country, even sitting here in Boston, in a manner that would have been impossible, prior to this technology.
And I've seen, a place, I believe Nigeria has been coming up with interesting models of both sort of using different levels of care, from sort of community peer support on up, and considering how, telehealth or sort of phone usage may be used in order to support that, to build capacity, which is also, definitely a positive move forward in that way.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. I just want to thank all three of you for a great discussion. I really enjoyed this. I hope this has been helpful to all of those of you who are participating, both synchronously and asynchronously, because I think this is being recorded. So, again, appreciate both the International Neuroethics Society as well as the Italian Society for Neuroethics for their support. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.